Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward. My name is Anne Cooper. I'm a coffee roasting consultant, trainer and roaster based in Melbourne, Australia. Now this is the second in a series of 5 videos, and I've been given the amazing opportunity to take over the series while Lee is at Coffee Fest in New York. Now in case you missed the first video, that was just an introduction of myself and a little bit about my career so far, and also an introduction to the topic for these videos, and that would be beyond the cooling tray. Now this is something I like to talk about in terms of what are we focusing on other than the actual physical roasting process itself. How do we know we're setting ourselves up for success? How do we know we're doing okay? Are we on the right track? So some of the, probably one of the biggest questions I get asked with my consulting and training, and because I have such extensive exposure to a wide range of roasting machines, a lot of roasters will ask me, what is the best machine to buy? So the focus for this video will be knowing your machine. Now, when I answer that question, I used to be quite hesitant with roasters and sometimes not sure. But now, after doing some research, definitely in the last 3 years, I will very, very confidently answer to a roaster, buy the machine you want to buy. So set yourself up with a machine that will suit your own specific situation. So definitely kind of like buying a car, we definitely consider things like price point. So can you afford it? And there's nothing wrong with putting yourself into a particular price point. Do you like the design? Do you like the look of it? Do you like the build quality? Do you like the materials? And then probably most importantly, something that I really focus on as well is, do I like the controls? Do I like the way that the roaster drives? And I know that is definitely something that I will gravitate towards a particular roasting machine because I like the way that it drives, and if it allows me to focus on my roasting nice and clearly, then I will clearly enjoy using that roaster and would very confidently recommend that roaster as well. Now, another thing that we need to talk about in terms of choosing a machine is a lot of roasters do hear what I call the community myth, in that they often have this thought process that if they buy a certain brand of machine, it will give them a specific flavor. Now, this is something that myself and Rob Hoos have had the opportunity to try and disprove. So in the last 3 years, we developed a research project called Can You Taste the Roasting System, where we essentially got the same coffee with the exact same profile, and we roasted it on 3 different systems. We then set about to do a whole heap of triangulations and tastings with a whole range of industry professionals, and have basically been really breaking down that community myth that if you buy a certain machine, you will get a specific flavor, when in actual fact, it's the profile that influences flavor, not the machine. Now, if you want to read a little bit more about the research and see all of the data and information for that, it was released in Roast Magazine this time last year. And you can also find a copy of the article on my website, so eqmr.com.au, and then just click on the articles page, and it's the first article on the page there. So you can definitely read about and see all of the really awesome information that we've gathered with that research. We also developed it into a workshop for SEA. So since the last 3 years, we've also been teaching it at Expo. So you can definitely sign up to do the class and really get involved in the whole experiment and research, and really get a better understanding on how, again, it's the profile that influences flavor, not the machine. So getting back to knowing our machine, I guess with all of the many different designs of roasting machines out there, there's just a few key things that are really good to focus on, and just some tips and tricks and things that I like to really have a look at on a roaster before I step up to it and start roasting on it. So things I will always want to get to know is the type of drum that it has. So depending on whether it has a single wall or a double wall drum, and whether it's a solid or a perforated drum, that will also be tied into the type of burner. So the type of burner will be in there to suit the type of drum. Now, it's also important to remember another myth that does pop up is that there's cast iron drums in roasters. Now, that needs to be squashed ASAP. There is no such thing as a cast iron drum. It is not possible. It is way too heavy and it retains the heat way too much. Your drums on your roasting machines will always be a form of mild steel. And then again, depending on the type of burner, so whether it's an atmospheric burner, a pillow radiant style kind of burner, a power burner, or if it's hot air convection, and you have a separate furnace blowing the heat through the system, that will definitely then influence the type of drum that is in that particular brand of machine. Another thing to think about with your drums, and another thing we get a bit tricked up on, is drum speed. It's quite important to remember that the motor driving the drum speed, so there's two readouts that you'll be seeing on your machines. There'll be the hertz, which is the speed at which the motor is operating at, so it can then efficiently be turning your drum at a particular revolutions per minute. So it's always quite important to remember that the hertz will always be lower than the RPM or the revolutions of your drum. Now, it's also a little bit frustrating in that a lot of the research and information out there with recommended drum speeds has often only been based on one brand or design of machine. Now, it's important to remember, I will always reinforce to roasters, please trust the manufacturer. They know their machines, especially when it comes to drum speed, because they've designed their drum in a particular way, and that design will be tied to how wide it is and how long it is. So, for example, we do see a lot of research being based on Probat, for example. Now, Probat roasters have very wide drums, and they're also generally quite short in comparison to other brands. So that means that their RPM will fall into that 52 to 54 kind of range, because the beans have less distance to travel from the front to the back of the drum. When you start moving into drums or roasting machines that either have a single wall drum, the materials are a little bit thinner and lighter, and also the drums are also more narrow and longer, it makes sense for that RPM to be a lot faster, because in order for the beans to move from the front to the back in a more efficient manner, or potentially at a similar rate to a wider drum, the RPM does need to be a lot faster. So those drums will be rated anywhere between 60 to 66 RPM. It is perfectly normal for those roasting machines to be spinning that fast. Then you do come across machines with their own unique design in terms of, for example, Diedrich, where they have a single wall drum, they've got their beautiful pillow radiant style burners, but that also then means that the drum will be spinning at a much different revolution rate as well, based on the design of the way that the burners work in that machine as well, and the airflow. So those drums do tend to spin anywhere between 40 to 45 RPM. I do believe they can go below 40 if required or needed. So if you're a Diedrich owner and you're reading information about a Probat, you are going to get yourself into all sorts of trouble if you're trying to force that roaster to spin at an unnecessary RPM that doesn't suit the design of the drum and the roaster. So please definitely trust the manufacturers and the design and the way that they've set up the revolutions for their drums. One thing that is kind of cool with drums and drum speed in particular, if you do have the opportunity to put a variable speed drive onto your roaster, you can get yourself out of a pretty tricky situation. If you're lagging in energy and you have an option to increase the drum speed, you can increase the heat transfer in your roasting. So drum speed is very much tied to heat transfer, but again, we also need to consider the thickness, the type of drum, materials, burners, the whole checklist from there. So then, while we're talking about burners, of course, then we briefly mentioned the different burner types. So those different burners are very much influenced by the type of fuel. So whether you're using LPG or natural gas, look, they each have their own pros and cons in terms of the power that they can deliver to the roasting machine. But definitely, if you don't have enough power in your gas coming into the roaster, then you will most definitely struggle trying to achieve a particular profile if you have something in mind. So before you start blaming the poor old machine, definitely, assess again the roasting profile that you want to achieve, and does your machine have the right amount of power to be able to deliver that roasting profile for you. So then, of course, that brings up the kind of controls. So many different machines have different styles of control panels. So now, when we all first started roasting, a lot of us were working with very simple controls in terms of we just had high and low. That was it. There was no ability to modulate and take the burners and the heat through various different stages throughout the roast. Now, with a lot of the control panels becoming a lot more electronic, there's more ability to modulate. So you'll have a control panel where you're using a stylus or a pen, and you're just basically tapping in your burner percentages as required. Some roasting machines still do have a dial where you're then using a gauge to then move the dial to a specific number throughout the roast for your burners. And then there are some control panels where you're still having to tap, not necessarily with a stylus, but you might be just hitting an arrow to achieve a particular burner percentage along the way. So definitely, as I mentioned earlier, I'm very much influenced by the control, the way the machines control and drive. And if I enjoy driving that roaster, I would naturally gravitate towards liking using that roasting machine. And then finally, the biggest thing that we've all had the chance to realise a lot better, I would say more specifically, definitely in the last 5 years in particular, is probes. So if anything, when you're thinking about buying a machine, the two key questions, along with do you like the brand, does it fit your price point, do you like the design, you should also be focusing very hard on the kind of probes that it has, because with those specific probes comes a specific set of numbers and data to focus and work with as well. So it's important to remember, so here I have installed a separate probe as opposed to the default probe here. I wanted to do that so I could do smaller batch sizes, and I felt just having a probe positioned a bit lower in the drum would allow me just to be able to do those smaller batches. There is a significant temperature difference between having it lower in the door and having it higher in the drum. There can be, in excess of 20 to 30 degrees Celsius generally in the beginning of the roast. It's really quite spread. But the positioning of your probe is very much determined about the direction of the way your drum is spinning. So if your drum is spinning in an anti-clockwise direction, always make sure your probe is in where the beans are bunching up in the drum. So off to the right side for anti-clockwise, and then clockwise will be to the left-hand side. So positioning your probe in the correct part of the drum is imperative to capturing good data for yourself. And then also making sure that we better understand the thickness, because the thickness of the probe will definitely influence the kind of numbers that we're dealing with. Now, that is most definitely the most frustrating part of roasting, is when I'm doing a training session, I'm always very clear and upfront, and I have to say, I cannot give you the magic answers, because your machine has a specific probe relevant to your system, and in terms of the thickness and the type of probe, it will also bring along with it a certain set of numbers and data. So the thinner the probe, the higher and the faster the numbers will be. The thicker the probe, the lower and the slower the readouts will be. Now, how to deal with those data points and with those different probes is definitely something that I'll be focusing on a lot more specifically when Lee and I do our workshop in Portland. So Lee is putting together an amazing Map It Forward event over 2 days on the 22nd and 23rd of April during Expo. and I'll be doing a 3-hour course based on analysing roast curves and roast profiles. So I'll be going into a lot more depth as opposed to what I've done here in this very quick video. But this is just a bit of a snippet, just some things I've come across in my consulting and training. But I very much look forward to seeing you hopefully at the event in Portland. For our next video, we'll be focusing on knowing our green, because again, that's very much going to be tied to setting ourselves up for success for our roasting. And hopefully it's some great information that you guys can use in your roasteries as well. Thanks for listening, and look forward to seeing you for the next video.